Our focal point is Jesus demands that our righteousness be greater than that of the Pharisees. And the only way to accomplish that demanding task is to give our hearts to Jesus and imitate him. We tend to allow ourselves to outwardly manifest the inward attitudes of our heart. Jesus not only cares about our outward actions, but also our inward attitudes. Do you agree with that this morning? And for those of you who were paying attention last week, will remember that those are the first two, this very same focal points and introductions as last week. Some of you are probably thinking he forgot to change it. No, I did it on purpose. Because Jesus, after he tells his disciples that he didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law, he then concludes the statement by saying, the only way that you could enter the kingdom of heaven is if your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees. And then he lists 6 things that disciples of Jesus must do in order for our righteousness to exceed the Pharisees. I know the disciples were probably sitting there thinking as Jesus is telling them this, that how is that even possible? The Pharisees are the teachers of the law. They follow the law. They are strict about it. They're crazy about it. They're obsessed about it. God gave them 10 commandments and they added 604 other ones because they liked it so much. And so the disciples are probably thinking to themselves, how is it possible that our righteousness can exceed the Pharisees? They've made that their monopoly. And Jesus says, if you want your righteousness to exceed that of the Pharisees, do this. And then he lists 6 things. Last week we looked at the first one, where Jesus tells his disciples that it's not enough. You'd heard long ago that it was said that if you do not murder your brother, that's the 6th commandment. Do not murder. And then Jesus says, but according to my kingdom and my ethic, not murdering somebody isn't enough. We all take that for granted. We don't murder people. I bet you don't know anybody within your personal family, within your circle of friends that has ever murdered anybody, because it's so uncommon that it's just something we know not to do. And it takes a snap of the human psyche. It takes a psychopath, an antisocial person to be able to commit murder against somebody because we know not to do it. It's ingrained in our heart not to murder somebody. But Jesus says it's not enough for you just not to murder anybody, because even the pagans and the unbelievers do those kinds of things. They follow those kinds of laws and that ethic. It's not enough not to murder somebody. If you hate somebody in your heart, you've already murdered them. That's what Jesus says. That's what Jesus' ethic is. It's not enough not to murder somebody. We all know not to do that. But if you hate somebody in your heart, you've already committed murder. And Jesus says that anybody that says raka, which is a Jewish term meaning empty-headedness or a numbskull, you could be liable to the Sanhedrin, into the court of law. But Jesus says if you call somebody a fool in your heart, you're liable to the fires of Gehenna. You see how Jesus is taking the ethic of the Old Testament, the 10 Commandments, and he's amplifying it and saying it's not enough. If you want your righteousness to exceed that of the Pharisees, you must go above and beyond what the law says to what I intended the law to say. Because we could read it in black and white. Don't murder anybody. We all see that, and it's common sense. Don't murder somebody. But the intent that God had designed the 10 Commandments around was, if you hate somebody enough, you're going to probably murder them. Don't do that. I'm sure we've all felt that way. You felt so angry at somebody that it builds into hate, and it builds into resentment, and it builds into bitterness. You want to wrap your cold fingers around their necks and just squeeze the life out of them. That's an inward attitude of your heart. And Jesus says it starts in your heart. Murder starts with hate, and that begins in your heart. Don't do that, Jesus says. Now Jesus moves on to another commandment. Now he talks about the seventh commandment, that a man isn't supposed to lust after the wife of his neighbor or friend or brother or relative. The seventh commandment says, don't do that. Don't covet your neighbor's wife, because that leads to immorality and unrighteousness. But Jesus, again, takes the Ten Commandments, sees it as a foundation starting point, and then adds his intended meaning behind it. Jesus is God incarnate. The Ten Commandments were from God. Jesus is telling the people at the time during the Sermon on the Mount, I gave you the Ten Commandments, you heard it, you obeyed it, but you only heard it and obeyed it in part. This is what I meant. And Jesus says this, you have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. One thing needs to be established from the very outset, because this could be some confusion here. Jesus isn't literally telling you to pluck out your eyes if you just happen to look at a woman for too long. He's not telling you to cut off your hands if you've committed sins with your hands. He's meaning it spiritually. He's meaning it metaphorically. He's meaning it in a way that the Jewish listeners at the Sermon on the Mount would understand, because it's a Jewish idiom. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. If sin causes you to commit an action against God, it's better for you to remove that part of your body or part of yourself or part of your psyche or part of your nature, because in removing it, you'll be able to enter the kingdom of heaven. That's what Jesus is saying. He's not saying physically gouge your eyeballs out. And some people have taken that literally in the past, and they've done it. But Jesus isn't saying to do that. What he's saying is, if you have a spiritual condition that's causing a spiritual consequence, take care of it. Because if you don't, you are subject to the fires of hell. Now, we've seen that metaphor from last week, right? Jesus builds a very powerful word picture to his disciples, because he doesn't actually say the word hell. There isn't necessarily a Greek word meaning hell other than Hades, which was a place of the dead. But in Greek, what Jesus is talking about is the place called Gehenna. And Gehenna was an actual literal place on the outside of the city walls of Jerusalem, where they would pile garbage and refuse and waste, and they would burn it on fire, and the fire stayed lit constantly. It never went out, because there were people constantly taking garbage there. There's a little bit of a darker history to Gehenna. It was also the place before Israel inhabited the Promised Land that the Canaanites would sacrifice children to Molech. And they would do that by fire. So this place became known as a place of contempt. That's why they burnt their garbage there. It was the only suitable place for them to do anything with the real estate, so they burnt garbage there. And the fire never went out, and you only went there to burn your garbage. You didn't stay there. You didn't roast marshmallows there. You didn't roast weenies there. You went there, you threw your trash, and you left. You never stayed there. And Jesus is telling his disciples in a very vivid word picture, if you look at a woman with lust in your heart, you've committed adultery with her, and you are subject to the fires of Gehenna. For his disciples, for Jesus' disciples, this would have been immediate power stroke to the heart. You wouldn't want to go to Gehenna. It's not a place you want to be. So Jesus is saying, do not subject yourself to the fires of Gehenna because you lack the ability to control your flesh. And it's interesting because if there's any sin that would describe humanity from the very beginning of our existence until now, the 21st century, it is the lust of the flesh and the pride of life. Those two sins consume every other sin when you think about it. The love of money, the love of power, the love of being in control of other people. It all starts with the lust of your flesh and the pride of life. Everything else is built off of that. And it just so happens that we're preaching this sermon today on Father's Day. This is divine providence, as it were. I was supposed to have preached this sermon last week, but because of baccalaureate, we're preaching it this week on Father's Day. And it just so happens that one of the greatest sins and struggles for men is lust. The old advertising adage, sex sells, and it's true for men, it does. And that's why when you watch any kind of a TV show geared towards men, whether it be NASCAR or football or basketball, they always have commercials of scantily clothed women running around on the beach with beers in their hands, because that's what appeals to human nature. That appeals to the nature of man. And as men, God has created us to be visual people, to be visual creatures. We are driven by what we see with our eyes. And it's not just women. It's the nice, shiny 1965 Ford Mustang, whether it be black or red with the racing stripes, that does something to men. Whether it be the nice aluminum Duckworth boat, pristine, beautiful, there's something that captivates men about that. It's the shiny things that men are attracted to, right? We're kind of like fish. We see the shiny lure go by and our heads do this, no matter what it is. And some of us actually take the bait and we get taken to some place we don't want to go, and that's the frying pan. But one thing we must realize is that we are not without the ability to control our flesh. We can. It's called self-control. It's one of the 9 fruits of the Spirit. And what Jesus is telling us here in this long sermon that would have taken several days for him to preach, it wasn't just one 30-minute session on a Sunday morning, it would have been days and days of him preaching, is he's telling us that everything in your life begins in your heart. Jesus says, out of the abundance of your heart, your mouth speaks. Out of the overflow of your heart, things pour out of you. And last week, we see that Jesus is looking at hearts that are geared towards our heart in our mouth, which is anger and hatred. And now Jesus is talking about sins that are geared toward our heart and our eyes and our hands. But it all begins in our heart. Where is our heart? You know, there's things that happen in your heart. And there was an old term in the 1980s, at the early stages of computer programming. They made up a thing called garbage in, garbage out. They called it GIGO for short. Whatever programming you put into the computer is what you would get out of it. The same thing is true with us. If we're men that are driven by our flesh, fleshliness will come out of us. Whether that be anger or hatred or lust and wanting things that do not belong to us. This was the sin of David. King David, the great King David, who was the man after God's own heart, is what God said about David. David was a man of lust and a man of the flesh. He saw Bathsheba taking a bath naked on her rooftop, saw her there and wanted her, coveted her, lusted after her, and he went and got her at the price of her husband's life. David took Bathsheba's husband. Israel just happened to be in the middle of a war. He wanted Bathsheba so bad that he put Bathsheba's husband on the front lines of the war, knowing that he would die and he could get her. But he had already committed a sin with Bathsheba in his heart. You see, the sin didn't start with David's action of putting Bathsheba's husband on the front line so that he could have her. David's sin started in his heart. Seeing her naked on the rooftop taking a bath, that's where it happened. You see, that's where sins start. Sins don't start in the action of committing the sin. Sin starts way before that in the attitude that you possess about it. And sometimes we're like David. We're looking out our window and we see something we want, we covet it, we need it, we lust after it. It controls our every waking thought, our every thoughtful decision, and then we do something to get it and we sin. But it all starts in our heart. It's the happenings of our heart that determine the actions of our life. And those could be negative things, those could be positive things, but it all starts in our heart. And you're probably starting to see something very apparent, is that Jesus is telling us to guard our heart. You know, our mouth can do one thing, but it starts in our heart. Our hands can do something, but it starts in our heart. It's the attitude of our heart that dictates what we do with our life. And if our righteousness is to exceed the Pharisees, it's not enough to follow the law, because the law cannot save us. It has no power. It has no ability. It starts with your attitude towards the law. If you sit there and think, I'll just do anything I could do to get in by the skin of my teeth, you're not living on purpose and you're not being intentional with your life. Because that's not what Jesus demands of us. The Pharisees do that. Jesus said our righteousness exceeds the Pharisees. And then Jesus gives us a prescription. Right? You guys see that in there? What does it say? If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. What causes you to stumble? The lust of your flesh, the pride of life, envy, bitterness, jealousy, rage. Whatever it is, cut it out. Jesus is commanding us to commit spiritual surgery on ourselves. And it's going to hurt. Surgery is never fun. It's always painful. There's always recovery. You got to sit in the recovery room after they've given you the drugs to put you to sleep. It's miserable. You got to deal with the itchiness of the stitches, the pain, the loss. But in the end, it's all worth it. No matter what amount of pain you've gone through, it's worth it. Why is it worth it? Because at the end of the day, you get your salvation. You get eternity with God, which is the greatest gift you could ever have been given. That's why the Apostle Paul says this brief, light, momentary affliction, I've said it 1,000 times, is building for me an eternal weight of glory that far outweighs it all. No matter what the pain is, it far outweighs it. You have a problem with lust, you gouge your eyes out. Not literally, of course, please don't go home and do that. But spiritually, it's going to hurt because it means giving something that has been so fundamental to yourself that changing it is going to be painful. It might mean that you need to change the group of friends you hang out with. It might mean that you never get to go to Hooters anymore and enjoy the wings. But it's something that you do because it's causing you to miss the mark. You see, the word sin in Greek is actually hamartia, which is a term of archery, which means that you've missed your mark. Every aim of every archer has always been to hit the bullseye. I occasionally have the opportunity to go teach archery classes. I'm a certified archery instructor, not to brag, it's just a statement of fact. But I get to go work with kids and teens, teaching them how to shoot bows and arrows. And every single one of the kids always has the goal of hitting the bullseye. I've never met a kid who says, I don't want to hit the bullseye, but I want to hit the backstop behind the target. Every kid wants to hit the bullseye because it's a sign of accomplishment. It's a sign that they've completed their task. They've done what they were supposed to do. It's meaningful for them to get the little slip of paper that says, Johnny got a bullseye in archery class today. It's a sign of they've done something well and they've done something meaningful. And even for us as human beings, we love to hit the mark that God has set for us. But sometimes there's some kind of scandal in our life, which is exactly the word that they use here to describe causing you to sin. That's the word scandalizo in Greek, which we know in the English word scandal. That's where the word scandal comes from. It causes us to stumble and we miss the mark and we fail over and over again. But it's the attitude of our heart that God is looking for. You see, God doesn't want us to strictly keep the law because the law, I said, is not powerful enough to save us. What God wants from you is your heart to be in the right place, and though you stumble, and you will, to gather yourself back up again and say, God, I'm sorry, I've missed your mark. I have not been righteous before your eyes. Please help me be better next time. And God will help you do that. But it's painful. But a painful loss of a part is better than losing the whole. Because that's the consequences. Jesus is saying you could either enter into heaven with one arm or one leg or one eye or one ear or half of your nose. And that's okay. You'll still make it to heaven. But if you continue on in the lust of your flesh and the pride of your life, all of you will be lost to the fires of Gehenna. What would you rather have? An eternity in heaven with one leg with Jesus, or never having Jesus and spending eternity in Gehenna? But we must be willing to commit spiritual surgery on ourselves. And it's hard for us to commit surgery on ourselves. I remember watching a documentary of a lady who was part of a team of researchers that were going to spend a year in Antarctica. They were living up there in tents and makeshift structures, and it was cold. It was hard. It was desolate. They only got shipments of supplies once a month. And this lady found out throughout the process of the year that she had developed a tumor in her breast. And it was aggressive. There's no doctors. There was one nurse. She had taken pre-med in college, so she knew a little bit about medicine. But they decided that she needed to do surgery on herself if she wanted to survive the year. They couldn't get her off the camp where they were at. There was this intense blizzard that had been going on. It needed to be done. She did it herself. And I thought, how remarkable would that be to have to do that to yourself? They didn't really have any kind of anesthesia other than some little bottles of hydrocodone that they'd taken for emergencies. There was no sedation, no oxygen, nothing. But the lady survived because she was willing to do it. She could have said, I can't do that. That's too grotesque. It's too harsh. It's too painful. I would rather die. Or her other decision was to do it, get it over with, and survive long enough to make it to treatment in the real world. And she did it. But that has to be the motivation of her heart. God, what is in my life that is causing me to miss the mark? What is causing me to be unrighteous? God, help me remove it. But a painful loss of a part is better than the loss of a whole. And it's hard. And I'm not going to stand up here and tell you it's easy, because it's not. I've been there. I still am there. But being a disciple of Jesus Christ means taking the initiative and having the motivation to want to be exactly where Jesus wants you to be. I can only imagine what the disciples of Jesus were thinking as Jesus is telling them this. Some of them most definitely were thinking, this is too difficult, I can't do it. After Jesus is done feeding us the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, I'm out of here. Some of us have that attitude with church potlucks, right? That's why we don't have potlucks before church, it's always after. Some of the disciples were probably thinking, I love Jesus enough that I'm going to stick with this and I'm going to do it. Some disciples of Jesus were thinking, it's too hard, I can't. Some of the disciples were thinking, Jesus is completely crazy, he's a madman. He wants us to gouge our eyes out and cut our hands off. But the ones who knew the heart of Jesus knew exactly what Jesus was saying. And Jesus tells us in the Gospel of John that his sheep know his voice and they follow him wherever he goes. And if you're one of those people that proclaim that you're a follower of Jesus, that is what is required of you. You follow Jesus no matter where he goes, no matter how scary it is, no matter how desolate it is, no matter how barren it is, no matter how dry it is, no matter how harsh it is, you go where Jesus goes because you're a follower of Jesus Christ. So the happenings of our heart control what happens in our actions. A painful loss of a part is better than the loss of a whole. And if we want salvation, we got to be willing to commit spiritual surgery on ourselves. You see, I don't know your heart. You do, and God does. I don't know the secret sins that happen in your life behind closed doors when the lights are off and nobody's looking, but you do and God does. And in order to be a disciple of Jesus, our righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees. And we do what nobody else will do. We go where nobody else will go. And we behave like followers of Jesus. Our final thought this morning is, if any 2 sins were to describe the continuing state of humanity, especially in the 21st century, they would be the lust of the flesh and the pride of life. All sins start from that point and branch out like cancer to ravage our souls. Men are particularly troubled by the lust of their flesh. We men are inundated by images and graphics that appeal to our basest nature and the depravity of our flesh. Sex sells in so many companies that can brand their products on scantily clad women will betray us into committing the sins of our flesh. The enemy knows our weaknesses, and within his kingdom of this world, he sets out to destroy us. Whether it is with half-dressed cheerleaders, ring girls, seductively dressed women in advertisements, we must remember to guard our hearts and our eyes. Now, desire in general isn't a sin, but misplaced desire is. I am sure we are all very attracted to our wives. God made us men to be visual creatures. But we should not covet and lust after what is not ours and what we cannot have. If we struggle with the lust of our eyes, it is better to perform spiritual surgery on ourselves, remove the issue, and retain our eternal inheritance. You see, the gratification of your flesh lasts, 5 minutes? Got to keep doing it over and over again to keep the gratification going. It's kind of like doing heroin. I've never done it, but from what I know about it, you do it, the high wears off, you do it again, you keep doing it. It's a never-ending cycle of repetition. You got to keep getting the bump, you got to keep getting the hit, you got to keep going after the pleasure, you got to keep going after the gratification. And every sin of our flesh is like that. Whether it be lust, we got to keep doing it to keep the gratification going. The one thing about God and the existential nature of who He is that when He fulfills you forever. God is the ultimate fulfillment of every longing of our heart, everything that we've ever needed and everything that we've ever tried to use to replace that with always comes up short. Because God's the only one who can fill it. Blaise Pascal said that in the heart of every human creature is a God-shaped vacuum, and only a God-shaped object can fill it. But oh, how in our indulgence and our impotence we try to fill the hole with everything else but God. The lust of our heart, the pride of life, power, money, sex, greed, envy. We all put that into the hole and it never fills it. And we keep doing it and we keep doing it. We keep doing it. It never satisfies us. But because God has made us for Himself, our hearts are restless until we find rest in Him.